you excited, Joey?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of CSI Skill Tree. In this new series, we'll take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eshrick. I'll be your host, and I'm the editor and program manager at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. I'm joined today by Liz Fiacco and Malik Toms, who I will talk a bit more about in a moment and introduce more properly. So a little backstory, we've been really interested in doing a series on games for a long time. We work a lot in written fiction, and we engage with pop culture like TV and movies through our public events. We've also branched out into a variety of other media, occasionally from podcasts to comics to art exhibits and more. But we haven't engaged much with games. And over the years that we've been running this center, it's become increasingly clear that they're a crucial space for science fiction storytelling and for engaging people with big ideas through the lens of future worlds and alternate realities. And games are an incredible force in the culture industries that fuel our imaginations. The industry, it turns out, generates significantly more revenue every year than the film industry, a couple times more at least, but it casts a curiously narrow cultural shadow. And for many critics and scholars, games are unknown territory. Despite being this really globally prominent medium for storytelling and entertainment, games can feel intimidating and insular to a lot of people. Like science fiction, the games industry and its fandom have also been sites for retrograde political views and violence against folks from marginalized communities. And so that can really justifiably scare away people who might otherwise be interested in learning more about the medium and engaging with the social and critical scenes around it. So with this series, we're going to try out a few different things. We hope to celebrate works of imaginative storytelling in games. We want to probe the connection between mechanics and narrative and consider how games can provide unique opportunities for unfolding stories and making people active participants in possible futures. So in our first few events, we might focus on a specific title like we're doing today, or we might take a more zoomed out look at a trend or trope or tendency. We'll also use games as a launch pad for discussing broader themes, from public policy to ethics to the future of technology, areas like space exploration, automation, or bioscience. Our games will include, our guests will include game developers, scholars, critics, journalists, science fiction authors, and other interesting folks working at the intersection of technological change and storycraft. And today, we'll be discussing a game called Subsurface Circular, which is a kind of mystery adventure developed and published by Mike Bithell Games and released in 2017. The game's only a couple hours long, and I promise we won't spoil it today. And it's available on Windows and Mac, iPhone, iPad, and most recently Nintendo Switch. So you can get it if you have some sort of device pretty much anywhere. In Subsurface Circular, you take on the role of a robotic detective unraveling a mystery about robots going missing by engaging in a series of branching conversations. The game takes place in a future where these humanoid intelligent machines, which are called techs, have taken on a huge variety of social roles, from construction and athletics to research and caretaking. And the game unfolds entirely inside this subsurface circular, which is an underground metro that only techs use. So when I've been talking with folks about this game, I've been saying that it's about artificial intelligence, structural oppression, segregation, and public transit. But it's not clunky in handling this like cloud of potent themes, like some other stories that we're probably all familiar with about existential robots yearning to be human or wanting to wipe out all organic life, or sometimes both. It tells its story instead against the backdrop of a socially complex world, with techs and humans aligning themselves with different subgroups and factions that feel differently about crucial issues like robot rights and human-robot relations. And it's this plurality of different voices and opinions in the game that makes it feel so grounded, as we'll talk about more, despite its distant future setting. It also tells the story from the perspective of techs, from the perspective of the oppressed, of the people who are subject to segregation in this world, rather than through the eyes of a human protagonist from the dominant group. And I hope it's a useful lens, therefore, for us to talk about themes of inequality and oppression in the real world and in games, especially in this time of protest and increased attention to racism and oppression. And I hope it's an invitation for us and for everyone to think about how gameplay can be an opportunity for critical thinking and political conversation. As I said earlier, I'm honored to be joined for this episode by Liz Fiacco and Malik Toms. Liz is a game developer who's worked on a number of commercial games, including Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, Pillars of Eternity, and South Park: The Stick of Truth. She's passionate about interactive narrative and about building emotional connections to characters through game mechanics. And we will talk a bit more about her work along the way too. Malik is an author and educator and a frequent collaborator of our center as well. He's written for a number of role-playing games, most recently Shadowrun 6th edition, and he currently is teaching a science fiction course at Chandler-Gilbert Community College. I just want to take a moment before we start to thank both of you, but Liz especially for helping me get my head around this series as I try to figure it out, and for your insights, and for helping select this game. I mean, for really just picking this game out and drawing my attention to it, and for being so delightful as a fellow traveler as we sorted out how to do this game series well.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm excited it's happening.
Me too. The three of us will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll turn to questions and comments from you. I hope we can have a lively discussion. There's a little Q&A button that you'll see on the bottom of your Zoom window that you can use to submit a question or a comment. We'll have a good amount of time to address those and mix it up. So without further ado, let's get underway. We'll start with the thing that I'm worried most about, which is showing you a short video of the game. I hope it works. We're going to show a short video snippet of gameplay from the beginning of Subsurface Circular, just about 2 minutes long. So very small slice, but it should give you a sense. And throughout the conversation, we'll drop in a couple of other very short clips from early in the game. Again, we won't spoil anything major, to give you a sense of the look and feel, and so you have some points of reference for our conversation. All right, so I'm going to try to do that screen share now.
The next station is Gateway. Change here for Outer.
All right. Were you all able to see that video, Liz and Malik?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, that's great. I tried it a few times, but I distrust the Zoom client's ability to handle multiple windows, even after all this time of it serving me so well. So Liz, I want to just start by asking you, when you and I were talking, like this was one of the first games we talked about as a way to kick this series off well. What do you think made it stick in your mind? Especially, it's been a couple years since release, and I think since you played it for the first time.
Yeah, no, it's been a little while since I like first played it. So I think it stuck out to me for a couple of reasons. One is that like I think it kind of it had like both like a nuanced way of going about like artificial intelligence. Like you kind of mentioned before, like usually there's kind of like a sort of like this like one track view of like, yes, robots are gonna like destroy us all. And it didn't really fall into that narrative the same kind of way. So it caught my attention for that reason. And then the other reason too was, yeah, it spoke to a lot of like societal injustices in like a really nuanced way as well. You kind of spend the game sort of like learning about what's going on in this world, and you hear like all these different perspectives as opposed to just like immediately like shining a light on like an obvious kind of parallel or something like that to like the real world. They really kind of, I don't know, made a really rich universe where this stuff could be explored.
Yeah. Malik, what about you? I think you have just recently been playing this game, and I don't know if you knew about it before, but what was your kind of first reaction to it at first blush?
Well, again, thanks to Liz for introducing me to the game, because it's a fun and a different journey when it comes to looking at AI sort of games. And you're right, it's not the typical robots are going to kill us all and take over the world kind of game. What I thought was interesting was the fixed perspective. So you are this detective tech and you're sitting in this chair for the entire game. And that's tough to do because we are really a visual society, especially with games. So how is it that you're still able to keep a viewer's interests? And they do a really good job of using lighting and sound to keep us engaged, but also in the robot design itself. I found that the robot aesthetic was different than what I expected, interesting, reminded me a lot of the idea of skins that's become so popularized by modern shooters, where each robot comes in with its own different look. Even though they have the same profession, they don't look the same. And who's that for is the question I immediately asked. Is that for the robots themselves or for their quote unquote owners? And it made me think more just to see how things were designed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I wanted to pick up on as we were kind of rolling into the game in the first place. This visual design, I think, is really sharp in this game. And I agree. It's they're working with a lot of constraints, as you said, Malik, around, pretty limited movement. But every character feels really distinctive. I don't know, Liz, if you have some insight into like how they might have done that from the development side, but I feel like there's something about movement and like little details here that it's really quite cinematic too for something that doesn't move a whole lot.
Yeah, I explored a little bit of the dev commentary on the game, so I could like make sure I could speak to it a little bit. And yeah, I think for them, because it was like such a small team under such a small time constraint, they weren't shooting for like this like hyper realistic styled game, because like that would be out of scope for their team. So, but they did want to make sure like all of the robots kind of like came across with like a strong personality. Yeah, and they did some, because like everyone is kind of like relatively stationary, like you don't have to like, there's like a lot of development time that goes into like even just like doing locomotion and like moving around spaces and like collision that they didn't have to necessarily worry about for this. So they could kind of focus on just making like really individualized like posing for like each of the robots and kind of like letting kind of the regular movement of the train kind of carry the rest of it, which I think is like a really it's a really clever way to like get a lot of like bang for your buck, so to speak, when it comes to like the development side, which is awesome.
Yeah, that facial structure too, of like those flat planes with a little bit of color and a kind of different chassis shape, I guess you might say, for each
Yeah.
bot's head is
And
really, I don't know, it really sticks in my head. I have a really easy time visualizing moments from this game compared to others.
yeah, in terms of like setting up like the rigs and stuff on like the robots, also that saves a lot of development time because you don't have to worry about kind of like with humans, you have to worry about all these like soft shapes that deform in weird ways. And like with robots, it's just kind of like, you know, exactly the way that they can move and nothing deforms. So they kind of have to build in the expressiveness kind of into like that baked shape, which I think probably informed a lot of their like art, like the design of like what they actually look like.
Yeah.
What was cool about that for me was that it forced us to gender the robots ourselves. And even in the beginning, they asked you to gender yourself as a robot. I chose not to, but even in choosing not to, it's like, when I say theta, does that mean I'm a male or female? What does that mean? And it reminds us that we think in gender quite a bit, even with the robots. There's not to give too much away, there's a nanny robot at some point, and I immediately assumed that it was a female robot. I don't think robots have gender, so it's obviously not a female, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they really avoid that issue and they let you layer that on to the bots, but it does actually remind you, because all you know is the occupation and a kind of dialect style for each bot. Like it sort of hopefully forces you, I think, to reflect on like the associations you make when you hear construction or athlete or nanny or researcher or teacher, like in a way that you aren't always necessarily, we don't always like jiggle the frame on those things in our day-to-day lives.
I feel like the game to some degree even calls it out a little bit, even in the clip that we just saw of being like, oh, like when we put on this, like we joke for humans' benefit, like it could be possible that they also like gender up for like humans' benefit just because it makes humans more comfortable to like put this on, which is like an interesting kind of way to look at it as well, where it's like not inherent in their identity, but like it's like a performative thing.
Yeah, that actually is a good bridge to another thing I wanted to talk about before we go to the next clip, at least, is the way that this game is driven so much by dialogue, and to talk about that from a design perspective. But I think also the laser focus in this game on dialogue and on the management of dialogue and about learning about characters means that things like that kind of code switching or sort of different sort of masks that the bots put on, the text put on at different points, really comes to the forefront. There's a lot of times when you can get a tech in the game to talk outside of their programming, either forcefully or less forcefully through persuasion, to get them out of like their kind of human-oriented scripting. We learn a bit about relationships among techs that maybe have nothing to do with humans, but again, all that gets unfolded throughout the course of the game. But yeah, I thought that was kind of that's a theme that I've kept turning over in my head now that I've played all the way through, is the kind of theme of performance and the theme of like, I think code switching is probably the most appropriate term, that like the idea that these techs are putting on different aspects of their personality or foregrounding them at different moments. Is that, Malik, I know you've written, not just for Shadowrun, but other places about kind of, I don't know, cybernetic beings or beings that kind of, sort of blend organic and synthetic. Is that issue of performance kind of one that crops up, you think, a lot or is that kind of a unique angle that this game takes?
Well, it's an issue that does crop up a lot because the idea has always been for robots to perform as if they're humans. And from the human perspective, we want them to feel comfortable to us. And what is comfortable to us is what's familiar to us. And so robots are not only gendered, but robots can also be racialized. And you see that a little bit in this game and the way they talk, like you're saying, code switching, you have that sense. I had that sense with some of the robots that they were being racialized in one way or another. And that might just be from my own personal experiences. But it's an issue that does come up quite a bit, especially when you're talking about cybernetics. What are cybernetics going to look like? When you have a new arm, someone attaches a cybernetic arm, is the default going to be just that peach colored skin? Like, what is that? What's going to happen? And what are we drawn to accepting as normal versus abnormal? Like an R&B pink.
Yeah, and even just all the connotations that we load on, and they're social at one level, and of course, like we all have our individual sets of experiences that we layer, but like, what does it mean if there's like a curvature on this part of the face? What does it mean if like it's, you know, the bot's kind of extra color is like a bright green? What is it, you know, like I think those, you because you have so little to work with, you really do start to quickly kind of make assumptions about what, you know, again, like talking about a non-human organism, but about things like gender, race, and culture, right? Like where does this being come from, and like what, you know, how do we kind of make sense of it? And I think the game is smart enough about not letting us quickly fall into like these bots are analogs for humans, that it feels weird that you're making those assumptions. Like it feels strange enough because the bots keep reminding you that like, well, like, you know, I've been designed to act like this, or I'm acting like this because this is my job, or I'm acting like this because this makes people feel comfortable, and not because necessarily like this is in any way authentically what or who I am. So what about, I guess, like you've both written for games and video games as well, and as well as tabletop games, Malik, you know, like I was wondering about kind of like level design, the idea that this game is just, it's a, you know, it's, I mean, I don't want to say just, but it is a series of conversations very deliberately. And there are, despite the fact that you're on the train the whole time, it is cut into kind of chapters. So I was wondering what you all thought about the design and like how they kept the game, you know, in my opinion, really vibrant and moving, with that level design and the pacing of the conversations, even though, you know, folks who might be used to games with a lot more interactive options, like might say, okay, you can pull up a map and do dialogue choices, but like, that's it. But it really doesn't feel constrained. I was wondering how you two think they might have pulled that off so effectively.
I think the fact that it is kind of, that it does take place on this like public transportation system, there's like kind of the narrative chapters in the game, but it's also broken up into kind of stops that you're at. And it gives you this sense of like motion, kind of like both through space and time, that like, you're like, oh, well, I have to like make sure I have this conversation before their stop. So it adds like a little bit of sense of urgency to it. There's also kind of like a sense, they do a good job with blocking of like, bringing in characters, having characters leave, having characters kind of like shift positions and stuff. So even though like the space is the same, it's kind of like a play, where like a play can be like a one-room play, but like characters come in and out and everything like that. They kind of use that technique kind of in this game to just like help with the pacing. Like sometimes it feels crowded, sometimes it feels empty, that kind of thing.
I felt like the game sort of cheats a little bit with this idea of using us, making us be robots. Because, I mean, what does a robot do? The robot's function is to execute code. A robot is designed to achieve a certain goal. And the blocking, the way that the scenes are set up is that you go into each scene with a goal. And because you're a robot, you're forcing yourself to think in that way. Okay, how can I ultimately reach my goal? Whereas in a tabletop game or RPG, it's more open. It's more subject to, this doesn't have to be so linear. We could just abandon the quest. But in a game such as this, you know that it's going to be step by step by step, and because of who you are, and you're playing this character of a robot, you're going to try your best to achieve that step.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's both, like you said, it can be a cheat, but it's also kind of one of those meta things, which I think always comes in when you're playing a program being in a game. Like your character answers to management, the shadowy management, and you have a set of pretty constrained objectives, and you're even like, and I think I said this in my intro, but you're stuck. Your character can't leave the underground metro, as far as we know. So it is like this kind of meta thing of like putting you in the shoes of this program being, and I think a lot of games that try to reflect back gameplay experiences on us and be a bit meta about games will use robots in that way to say like, well, how free are you when you're playing this game? Like, what are your choices as a player?
Yeah, it's one of those things to try to like bridge that gap between like in real life, you know, or even a tabletop game, you can kind of do anything, but like when you're making a video game, you have like, you don't have infinite time and money to like make anything possible. So you do have to kind of like add in narrative on top of it to sort of explain away why a lot of decisions aren't available to you. So you can either kind of like hand wave it away, which is acceptable, or you can kind of like try to address it like this.
Yeah.
More explicitly.
Or add a narrative to explain why certain decision points are available to you. Like this idea, learn early on this idea of focus points, which allows you to sort of break your programming just to get around certain restrictions to find a way to solve your problem, which I think is, when we start to talk about machine learning, we start to talk about that idea of how do they find ways to solve the problem.
So I actually want to give us a little more input, if that's okay, and show another 2 minutes of gameplay from another conversation that your character has, and then we'll come back and talk a little more, if that's all right with both of you.
Sweet.
Okay, great.
The next station is finite instance. Change here for outer.
So, you know, I picked that clip, it's very early on, but you meet this researcher tech and it's very dense. You get some world building, you learn about the fact that climate change is part of this world. So you get a glimpse into that. You get to see that there are some interface elements like a map you can pull up. That's the first like puzzle in the game. And that's just, you know, introducing you to the fact there's a map. You also get to see some of the really charming metro station names like Finite Instance and Basic Source. And there's like 25 of those or something, and all of them are really clever. I think some of the later ones are even more clever, and they refer to other science fiction texts and things like that. So I really like that clip. It also gets into issues of ownership and freedom, which is really why I thought it was like a really good choice for this. And you know, the thing I wanted to talk about jumping off that clip is that this game is, as I talked about earlier, I think about oppression and segregation, and it suggests any number of real world parallels. But as you two have already discussed a bit, it's deliberate. I think the team is really deliberate about not collapsing the game and the text into any one-to-one allegory necessarily with race or class or other vectors of inequality. So I wanted to know what you all thought about like the game's kind of political messaging and lessons and what it has to tell us perhaps about things like AI and robot rights, or even, you know, human issues that it might suggest parallels to, like racism and class stratification and segregation.
I can jump in. The one thing that I really appreciate about this game and how it addresses it is almost all of the game is about listening to people. Like, it's literally about like asking questions and hearing people, like and that's from everything of like taking the case in the first bit and then trying to like find clues and answers, but then also it's about developing your opinion about it. So it's about trying to like figure out, like, you know, where like you want society to go, and like the actions you're willing to kind of do to get it there. So I think that was like a really cool perspective, as opposed to sort of like giving you a specific, like just telling you the way the world is and then just like assuming that's it. I think that, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to pick on this game, another game, but recently I played The Outer Worlds, which is like a more recent open world space opera game with a lot of dialogue. And that game does start with like a cutscene where you talk to another character who tells you like what the deal is in the world. And he sort of says like, there's this evil corporation and these people are kind of being held in like frozen stasis in this space station. And our job is to like right the wrongs of this corporate tyranny and like free those people. And whether you like that story or not, or whether you like how the game unfolds the story, I think Liz's point is like that game goes ahead and just tells you what's up front. It gives you all the information you need to kind of like grok the game's like basic plot setup, and also like gives you a pretty good map of the territory, you know, who the protagonists and antagonists are and what they're fighting over. This game, your character starts off not knowing almost anything, and you have to piece things together through conversations. And it's the kind of game that you, if you really wanted to get the full picture, it's the kind of game you can imagine playing with a notebook. You don't need one, but like if you really wanted to piece together the whole story, some bits of information are only available if you go down a bunch of optional conversation trees that give you more nuance and help you inform decisions you make later.
You know, I've thought a lot about this in terms of what I write. It's really difficult not to be allegorical to race and gender and class when you're writing, because it's like we were saying earlier, we have this tendency to identify certain things as what they are. I'll give you an example. I write a lot about orcs and trolls, and orcs and trolls tend not to be the wealthiest class. They tend to be the ones who die the earliest and get sickest the earliest. So naturally, people who read the work make that assumption that orcs and trolls are allegories for Black and brown people. They're not intentionally. In this game, robots can be seen as slaves because, you know, they don't possess rights. Why do we make robots? We make robots to do the jobs we don't want to do. Why do we have slaves? Same sort of idea. Robots have prohibitions to learning, and, you know, goes back to that 1740 law when we prohibited slaves from learning. It's really hard not to do that, but I think this game does a really good job of not making it about that, but offering the same structures in a way that helps us really consider why those structures are put in place and how we interact with them on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I guess it's worth asking, like, do you all think that robots and artificially intelligent machines, you know, is it a good choice to sometimes use those as an allegory for social issues? Like, I think this game feels fresh because it doesn't really let you map that allegory very cleanly. It kind of puts the issues in a blender perhaps, and like it's not as easy to figure out exactly how it all fits. But like are pieces of media that you all have either been involved with or just enjoyed or consumed or disliked maybe, like that use robotic type beings in that way, you know, can that be done well? Is that something to stay away from? I don't know.
Well, for me, science fiction, the goal of science fiction is to imagine a future that we expect or hope to live in. And I really, truly believe that at some point we're going to program machines sufficiently enough to simulate or perhaps even have sentience. It's a really hard question of what is sentience. But if we're having the conversations now about attributing rights to those beings, then it helps us understand when these things start to happen in the future. Yeah, this is how we're going to treat this new entity. So how are we treating the entities that exist in our own world? So I think it's important. I think it's a good look for us to see something outside of what exists and consider how we would treat it, because it helps us consider how we treat ourselves, each other, which is not good, by the way. Just putting that out there.
Yeah. I kind of like have like, to me, it's almost like I've got kind of like two separate thoughts on this. One of it is like, absolutely, like, let's use it as like an allegory to like make it more approachable for people who would otherwise like get their feathers ruffled, like tackling some of these like tougher issues. And like you said, like being able to like think through of like, what is like this like future that like we like want to like move towards, and like if we're going to do that, we have to use like allegories to the real world. In addition to that, machine learning and AI is part of our real world, and the stories that we should be developing for those, like we can use robots as like an allegory, but we should also think about using robots at like as they kind of are, or like AI as it is, and exploring the problems that exposes as well, which is pretty different than, especially like as it stands now. Like it's going to be different. Like we're not necessarily worried about like YouTube's algorithm like being segregated, but like we are really worried about YouTube's algorithm like wreaking havoc in other ways. So I think addressing those problems as well in science fiction would be worthwhile as well.
One thing too, it's really hard not to spoil this game, by the way, for everyone.
Yeah.
But one thing too, you know, that the game doesn't shy away from as the narrative develops beyond what we've seen. And what we see to start is like some texts are missing and you're tasked to go find them, and things branch out from there, right? Like any good detective story, it gets much more complicated, kind of a, you know, sort of a Chinatown type approach, I think. But the game doesn't shy away.
It's a little less grim than Chinatown.
Oh, for sure, for sure. But just that, like, you know, this, you know, everything gets deeper and there's a thicket of issues, and it's not just this one disappearance, right? Like, so that first tech who confronts you has a missing friend, and that's where it all starts. And of course it becomes this much larger thing. But the game does hint at the fact that, you know, the human world, just because we've offloaded a ton of labor onto these techs, that hasn't ameliorated social tensions among humans. And in fact, there's like political conflagrations. There's still huge, you know, divisions between privileged people and people who are marginalized or sort of lacking in privilege. And we don't get that much detail because the game doesn't want to have a bunch of human characters come in and have a political debate. But we do see it filtered through the perspective of the techs. So the game does have some messiness, and to kind of, what made me think of that, Liz, was your 2 points I think are connected in a way that it's like not just telling stories about AI as an allegory or as AI as a thing in the real world, but also this game points in a direction of telling stories in which machine learning and AI are connected to human oppression and human marginalization and inequality, that they're players in that like kind of landscape as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like, same deal, like not to like spoil stuff, but like there are definitely like techs that are involved in like corporations and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And they're like clearly being used like in this larger capitalistic structure that like, yeah, you get this sort of inkling of like, isn't like just the simple undercurrent of like a utopia. This is like problematic from like the ground to the top.
Yeah.
It also plays with the idea of freedom in an interesting way, because if we go back to that first conversation, this is a tech who is owned and enjoys it. And, when we think about the freedom to do X, Y, and Z, part of that is, what if somebody does want to be owned? What if a tech decides that that's the best way to fulfill its programming, to be owned? Are we only talking about freedom in terms of what we think is right, or, what is true freedom? I think this helps to open up that dialogue.
Well, and as that tech points out in that conversation, the tech you play and many of the other ones are run by management and serve at the pleasure of management. And, there are many of them talk about having, and it comes up in that first scene, intellect restrictions, restrictions on what they can learn, where they can go. So it's not as if that privately owned tech is, in this terrible state, and these ones are in sort of some kind of, post-depression utopia. They're just different forms of ownership, and their labor's being leveraged without their full consent in a bunch of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So I did want to ask, in light of discussions recently about justice and policing, defunding and abolition and the Black Lives Matter movement, it did strike me anew that this game, you play a certain sort of law enforcement officer. You're a detective. And maybe wonder what you all thought of that. And again, I think it's tricky without spoiling some things later. But I've read some stuff recently about how people pointing out something quite obvious, which is most stories about justice and the law that we get take a police perspective, or the perspective of the organized structural justice system. And I was wondering what you all thought of that in this game, if recent events have sort of like altered your perception of it at all, and or like other games that you thought maybe had handled these issues well or in a fresh way around justice issues.
Well, this is a tough one. This is a really tough one. So what I think that the game does well is to sort of help us explore the space that it does exist in policing and in justice, in terms of there's good and bad in it. And I think that's really reflective of what's going on now, for sure. I'll start with that. There's more to say.
Well, I'll also say that, what we call policing right now is a bundle of different social functions, and you're a detective. Mm-hmm. You're not, sort of a street level police officer, for example. You're this detective that actually is sort of like confined to solving cases that management assigns it in an underground public transit system only, as far as I can tell. So that's kind of an interesting spin on like that detective character, because you're so restrained in so many ways.
Right, and I think that's part of the confusion, especially when you're talking about this idea of defund the police. People don't listen to what that actually means. You hear defund the police, a lot of people assume it means, or abolish the police, it means that we're going to go crazy, and we're even getting tweets from the president about, if we defund the police, then the criminals win, they're going to go rampant because nobody will stop them. And that isn't what anybody's talking about. It's a reimagining. It's more of like what we're looking at in this game, where you have a specific role. Like a police officer's job is to solve a crime versus, find a cat hidden in the tree or whatever it is. Because, we're talking about mission creep a lot when it comes to police. Police used to be one thing, and now they're being held responsible for so much more, that it's not only is it taxing for the officer, but it also, it limits who's going to take that job on. It really limits the quality of the work that can be done for any one part of the task, because you're asked to do so much.
Liz, anything about,
yes.
I don't know, the game's perspective and what, how you think about that now, or other games that come to mind? I was trying to think about that, and I was having a hard time thinking about games that deal with justice. And, I don't play a lot of adventure games. And so I think some of these might, there's a lot of detective games out there in the adventure genre. But I was trying to think of games where it approached this differently. And it'll be interesting. If folks know of any, you should put them into the Q&A as a comment, and we can check them
Yeah,
out.
definitely part of the reason why I thought of this game like months ago. I think I recommended this game was because that I think it had I think it does have like way more nuance than like most games don't like question themselves, like question the role that you're given nearly as much as this one. And I think like the character that you end up playing in this one, it kind of has a foot in kind of both worlds. Like you're a tech, like you can't not be a tech. And you also like work for humans and you'll never be a human. And it kind of puts you in this interesting perspective of, I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, like your job is really to listen. And it's not to dominate. It's not to like enforce or anything like that. It's like to listen and to try and solve a problem that you're seeing in this tech community, which I think is kind of like Malik said, is kind of like the call with like this sort of defund the police is like, hey, like no one's listening to like what our needs actually are.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to be able to answer some questions from folks who are in our audience and listening in. So please go ahead and use Q&A to submit questions or comments, and I'll read them out to our panelists. In the meantime, while we give people just a second to do that, Liz, I wanted to just ask you, one of the reasons we picked this game months ago too, in addition to all the stuff we've talked about, I think, is that you're really interested in machine learning and AI in games. So this game doesn't have a proper machine learning system in it. But yeah, I was wondering what are some of the opportunities you think that'll open up? Why are you so excited about that? And what does that mean? Like how might that change games for people who aren't maybe as familiar with what that would look like?
Yeah, to sort of like clarify exactly kind of what I do on the side is actually integrating like machine learning algorithms into gameplay loops. So the idea is the player is kind of like teaching the game then kind of is able to respond to the player, and you have this sort of like live evolution of the way like games and the players can communicate. So it's something that is super experimental, it's super new, and like we've gotten some success with it already. And we'd love to like keep kind of expanding on those ideas, because game, like we kind of touched on this a little bit, like games are like very linear right now. And even like kind of like open games, they still have like these kind of like invisible walls of like confines of like what's possible in those spaces. So machine learning, there's some efforts to like use machine learning as like a content creation in games to sort of like expand like how much you can explore those spaces. What me and my brother, who's like my collaborator on this stuff, we're looking at is machine learning as like a tool to build relationships. So it just unlocks a lot of new verbs, like a lot of new actions the player can do. Like they can teach, they can praise, they can scold, they can demonstrate. These are things that like weren't really stuff that you could do in a game. Like teaching in a game before would be like, you just like walk up to someone and like press X, and like they got taught, but like the machine learning kind of makes it real in a way, which means that it can really be customized, and like you can see yourself kind of reflected back in a more distinct way.
I think for people who, who maybe don't, haven't played games a lot, or who've experienced only some really mainstream type titles, a common critique is that combat is like the only option for solving a lot of problems. And in talking to Liz, it does seem like I've been really inspired about the idea of machine learning as a way to enrich gameplay and like allow for what a lot of people sort of say they want from games, which is like an option to have like more nurturing or pro-social relationships with characters that don't revolve around combat, or even just like the dialogue trees we see in this game, as sophisticated as they might be.
Yeah.
We do have a couple audience questions. So Ed asks, this is a big question. We'll see what you all make of it. Do all video games end up asking us to become robots?
Yeah. In a real sense, all video games are limiting us to binary choices. And for me, binary language is machine language. It's this idea of you do X or Y. So in that sense, all video games that I've experienced are tracking us towards a singular goal. And you have this, you have these two choices, which in the end is really no choice at all because it's often tracking you towards that end goal and solving problem A. So in that sense, yeah, they're all making us very robotic, except for Minecraft.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I would say the exception would be like games that, rather than like giving you a goal to optimize for, they're really more of a sandbox for you to sort of express yourself. So Minecraft, Animal Crossing, The Sims, those are more like dollhouses. So there's something that you can express your humanity through.
Yes.
So Brian says there's been a lot of great conversation about this game tackling oppression topics. Is there anywhere it fell short on these fronts, or do you wish it had gone further? Is there room to improve? I don't know. Is there anything that struck you that you kind of wish the game had done? Again, we've been really trying to studiously avoid spoilers, partially because the developer, I'll say, for those who haven't downloaded the game yet, there's even like a little guide in there for people streaming and talking about the game, politely asking you not to ruin their game, because it seriously is like a 90-minute play. So, his feeling, Mike Bithell, is that if you stream the game, for example, like, why would someone buy it? Because it's already short, and some people don't like to purchase short games. I think this one's really worth the buy. But yeah, is there anything that you all noticed, or things you wish the game had taken on?
There are conversations, not giving too much away, there are conversations about ageism, and I would love to see that go further. I think it discussed it briefly, and that's an important conversation to have, but it's only touched upon.
I think for me, everything's got room to grow. I think for me, some of it, like in terms of like the racializing robots and genderizing robots, got lampshaded a little bit because they're like, oh, well, they're robots and they're doing it for people, which was like an explanation, but not necessarily an attack on the idea of like whatever assumptions the player might have made about these robots. So I think that could have maybe like either like been addressed a little bit more head on, or kind of pulled the rug out from under you like a little bit more. Nanny robot, like you initially think is like super gendered one way, and like they also get gendered like a totally different way, and it's more of a mix and match and things like that.
Yeah, I'll just say that doesn't happen a whole lot. There aren't a lot of like those kind of like whiplash turns where they kind of guess at an assumption you'll make and then challenge it. A lot of the characters are they draw on sort of human narrative archetypes. There's like a cranky old man at one point. It has like those kinds of things in it. I'll, in answer to this, bridge with a comment from Ruth, who asked if the gameplay experience is different if you choose to play as a masculine or feminine character, and I think there's really no mechanical reflection of that in the game. You get to choose a name, and you can sort of decide how you want to identify. My character's name was Claire, and it didn't change anything. I think if there were, this is adding a layer to the game, but if there were choices you could make about your self-presentation a little bit more, and if that changed how people reacted to you, I think that would be really interesting. That's a whole other layer to the game. So I'm asking it to do something that they deliberately chose not to do. But I think, given Ruth's question, I think that would be really, really interesting to kind of play with gender a little bit more. And the idea that, for example, a non-organic being you know, a bot might have any number of different kinds of gender assignments that are totally separate and different, or gender identities that are really different or more fluid than the ones that we recognize as humans today. Bodhi in Oslo thanks us for a great discussion. Hi, Bodhi. He is wondering if we had any thoughts specifically on the notion of the future in the game. We've been discussing allegory and metaphor versus robots as they are / AI in the future, but the game, he says, is still very much about the problems of society as they are now. And is there an inability to imagine a different future, whether human or machine, that's not conditioned by problems of the present? Do we end up necessarily falling into allegory because we're, you know, it's kind of taking on today's problems? Does the game have this difficulty imagining like an authentically actually different future, if I'm reading this question right?
I think the answer to that is a little bit in the title. To some degree, I think the game kind of posits the idea that like this is circular, like this happens all the time, and it happens again and again and again, and like the circumstances change, and like the groups change, but like there's this kind of consistent struggle against like people who take advantage of other people or robots or whatever, that like moves forward, goes in a cycle. I don't know, that's my take on it.
I love that.
Well said. It speaks to that and oppression. I think that it does imagine a future that has significantly less focus on corporatization. And yeah, that would be it. It's without saying too much, but I think that the idea of the corporate and the collisions between the corporate world and the government and the individual are not really spoken to. And I think that's a huge part of what's going to be happening as we move forward into our future.
So I'm going to ask two more kind of big questions from our audience because I think they're great. And then I'll ask the sort of parting shot question. So Cody says, Malik, you spoke a little bit earlier about the challenge of non-visual storytelling, given that our culture is so heavily visual. And for both of you, like what techniques do you lean on to make stories more evocative for readers and players? Are there things that you think are particularly effective that aren't just visual?
Sound is really important. Sound creates movement. Sound creates tension. You see that a lot in movies where it could be a black screen, but depending on what the score is behind that screen, you have a sense of how you're supposed to feel about the moment. And the speed and the heaviness and the tone really directs that. So that's definitely one thing.
Oh gosh, I lean on so many visuals for my job. Yeah, no, like Malik said, like sound is like a huge one. Yeah, like in terms of games, like choices are not necessarily always presented like in a visual manner, but the choices are kind of like the moments where you really try to make the player feel something, which is like, it's like this like abstract sort of thing, but yeah, like it's true, like we rely on so much for visuals. It's actually like kind of a problem in games because of like the accessibility issues with it. Like if like you're visually impaired, it makes it extremely hard to play video games. My old studio, Naughty Dog, they just did like a huge like push to get Last of Us 2 able to be played by blind people, but that was like kind of like this like studio-wide effort to make sure that there was enough sound to carry the gameplay like alone.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I've engaged with games criticism and writing, a lot of people laud games for telling stories visually and not through text, right? It's like, oh, there's all this environmental storytelling where like traversing an environment and like seeing little objects in the room and stuff helps tell the story. And that's actually considered to be I think that that's part of the zeitgeist of like, that's an effective use of the medium to tell a story, and not just doing text. Now this game is very text heavy deliberately, but so yeah, I think that's a new frontier. I do think the sound in this game is really effective. All of the sound effects, there's not a huge repertoire of them, but they're all very, I think, well chosen. I like the little clicky sounds as you pick dialogue options, especially. They're very satisfying.
You can think about accents and you know, code switching, language, tropes. One way to really like sort of, this is something that I actually saw. I don't know if you guys saw the movie The Hunt, and it was a really strange movie, but there was a moment where one of the characters is telling the story of the tortoise and the hare, but the way that it's told is told in their particular vernacular, and it changes the meaning and shapes your understanding of the character. And so that's one of those shortcuts that you can use, is take something familiar to the general audience and then say it in a way that's specific to that character. And that helps us understand who that character is, and thus moving the story forward.
So cool.
Yeah. Okay, well, I am going to shift to a final question and an outro because we're already at 2 o'clock. And Tyler and Stephen and others that ask questions, I'm so sorry. I will actually pass those along to our panelists after the event. But you know, I started this event by talking about that despite the size of the industry and the enormous role of games, they can often feel alienating or inaccessible to many people, as I've learned anew planning the series and talking to folks about it. So it can, you know, gaming can feel like the world's largest like exclusive subculture in a way, with this really thick line drawn around it, even though it's such a huge industry, which is strange. But so I wonder what each of you feel like we can do as fans of games, as critics, as developers, as creators, to help games and the conversations around them, which I think are becoming really rich, help those conversations and the games be more accessible and inviting to people who don't feel like they're part of the club, like they're able to participate. And also, especially, I think, to people from groups that have been historically marginalized and forcefully excluded from games development and criticism, fandom, and culture. So that question of accessibility in a broad way, I was wondering what you all thought about that to round us out today.
I think we're doing it, man. I really think we are. I think having conversations like these really help to push games into the academic universe, which they haven't been a part of. If you go back in time a little bit, you know, there was a time when movies were not part of the academic discourse. And now movies are everywhere. Movies are lauded as being a huge form of communication. Yeah. And whether we like it or not, games are that next evolution in very many ways. So we have to keep having these conversations. We have to keep creating characters that are diverse. So when you have a lead character, if they're always one thing, it's going to limit the conversation. But if they're different, they have different backgrounds and ideas. If they're robots, if they're, you know, flying cats, whatever it is that they end up being, it helps us really widen the conversation.
Yes. Yeah, I think that it brings real life issues to the forefront, like having queer main characters, having like racial minorities as main characters, having women as main characters are all like going to be super important, just because games have this like kind of unique ability to literally put you in the protagonist's shoes. Like you don't just empathize with them, you experience the things they experience. And then from kind of like a development standpoint as well, I think, you know, what Naughty Dog was doing to make things like physically accessible to people, as well as efforts, I think, to make things like the challenge accessible to people as well, is also going to be really critical. Being able to put like easy modes or ways that you can consume the story without necessarily being like highly skilled at the game, I think is pretty important, because like unlike a book or a movie, like you don't get like 45 minutes into the movie and then it like shuts off if you like don't run fast enough or something like that. So I think like getting rid of those like barriers to entry, there's like obviously a place for like competitive like high skill style games. Like if you're doing like competitive League of Legends or something like that, you want people who are like on your level, but but in terms of like getting these like narratives and experiences across, just trying not to like necessarily like gate that by people's like ability to like have quick reflexes or like think through like super duper challenging puzzles or everything like that.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to there a lot is the zone of proximal development, where you have someone's going to keep on trying as long as it's within their reach. If it's too far away for them to get it, they're not going to play it. And so as long as we're smart about keeping that zone in a way where people can develop, but not too slowly or not too quickly, that's really helpful.
Yeah, and I think using events like this and everything to sort of give people who are like new to the medium kind of a roadmap of like games that kind of start teaching the language of games as well, because like people who have gamed for a long time, they kind of know like, oh, I've got lives, I've got stamina, I've got these things that happen in a lot of different games. But for people who are like totally new to it and it's like really foreign, it's like easier to start with something like Subsurface Circular, which is a little bit more like the experience of like reading a book or choose your own adventure or something like that, and it might be a little bit more approachable. But yeah, I think I would love to like kind of grow the audience into something more diverse and get the word out on some of these like smaller games that have like really interesting things to say.
Yeah, go ahead, Malik, please.
I was going to add that price point matters. You know, if the entry cost for you to play a game is $0, then you're probably going to take the risk and play a game. But if it's $59.99, you're much less likely to take that risk. So it's important to have a price point that people can just say, okay, especially in these times when we are all so short on cash, you know, if I can pay $5 for a game, or, you know, donate $2.99 for Liz's game, you know, then we're going to play it. Plug in right there, Liz.
Yeah, Liz, I mean, if you want to learn more about Liz's machine learning work, I am just going to plug her game for her. She and her brother created a game called Lab Assistant that you can, I think, get for free, but there's probably there's an optional donate button, which you should donate also. But that is a game that integrates machine learning in a really ingenious way and deals with teaching and learning in a cool way. Yeah, I've just been astonished as I've gotten especially into starting to think about this series, but also just getting more knowledgeable about games culture, that there is, just like movies and TV or any other medium, of course, like this huge, astonishing range of experiences that you can have, and at different price points from different types of creators. There's, you know, websites like itch.io, which I believe, Liz, is where Lab Assistant is hosted, that have like a really amazing ecosystems of independent creators who are doing all kinds of great stuff.
Speaking of which, probably the best deal on gaming ever right now is on itch.io. They've got like over 700 games. You can donate what you want, and all of it goes to Black Lives Matter. So anyone watching this should go do that, because it is like the best deal in history. And all of them are going to be like weird, like indie, like interesting stuff. There's like high profile indie stuff. There's like indie stuff that no one's ever heard of. It's like a really good mishmash to try a lot of different things.
Yeah. All right, with that, I think I need to draw this to a close. Thank you both for being so generous with your time. So thank you so much, Liz and Malik, for joining us today, for kicking off this series so strong. This was a delightful conversation, and I've loved getting prepared for the event with you, and the opportunity to learn about this game. Just like Malik said, Liz, neither of us I don't think had heard of this, so it was a great experience. For each of you, what is a good place to find you and your work online if folks want to know more or get connected with you? Liz?
My Twitter is just my name, @Liz Fiacco. It's got links to like my itch page, and yeah, it'll be where I talk about like my work as it comes up.
And Malik?
I know I have a Twitter. I just don't know what it is. So it's probably not the best place. My website is talislegger.com, TALISLEGGER.com. Just, you know, musings and writing and me.
All right. So again, thank you both so very much. To everyone here, please check out Subsurface Circular, and thank you for your time and joining us for our inaugural event. Keep an eye out for an upcoming episode of CSI Skill Tree. I think we're going to do one next month in July, and we're going to try to do them about monthly for a while here and try some different things out and see how people like them. To get notified about episodes, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/imagineasu. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook at ImaginationASU, and you can also visit us at csi.asu.edu and subscribe to our email newsletter and learn about the center there. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. All right, goodbye.
Bye.